every once in a while it turns out we get a chance to talk to our heroes. This week's interview, podcast number 99, is with one of mine, Ian Boddy, the head of the Din label, but also an extraordinary musician. I was so happy that he was willing to talk, and I hope you enjoy this chat with him. Okay, today I'd like to introduce you to somebody for whom I'm a fan. It's really exciting to get to talk to Ian Boddy. Ian is the head of Din Records, which is a label that I love. He is he's put out a ton of releases. He, to me, kind of defines the modern version of classic electronic music. He does sound design, he does all kinds of stuff, and I am really excited to have him on the podcast. So with that, I would like to say hi to Ian Boddy. Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you, yes. How are you?
Great. So I kind of started blurting out the stuff you do, but maybe what I'll do is I'll let you kind of talk about the things that you do and the things that kind of make up your career.
Yeah, I guess I've got three prongs to the attack, as it were. Trying to make a living full-time being a musician is obviously quite hard. It's not getting any easier as well. So it's good to have more than one iron in the fire, as it were. So you mentioned Din. So yes, I run Din, and of course that means I release my own stuff on there, plus other musicians, and also myself in collaboration with other musicians and playing concerts. That's one thing. The second thing was the sound design you mentioned. That involves programming patches for mainly soft synthesizers, doing contact libraries of sounds, where I'm designing my own sounds a lot from the analog synths I've got. And then the third line of attack is I write production soundtracks for a company called DeWolf, and that's music that may get used on TVs, films, documentaries, whatever. So between those three activities, that keeps me pretty busy.
Right, indeed. Now you have what could almost be labeled countless releases. How many different releases have you been involved in?
I can't remember.
You can't remember either. Okay.
Yeah, it's a lot. Well, I mean, Din, obviously Din's approaching 50 releases on physical format. Not all those are mine. Right. I would guess I've probably been involved either solo or in collaboration with at least 35 to 40 releases over the years, and that's not including obviously all the library music work that I've done as well. So if you count those, it's going to be well over 50 releases.
Right.
But I no pun intended. I lose track.
Oh, I'll bet. I mean, it's you have got an incredible body of work. Now, what I like doing in the podcast is I don't tend to focus on things like gear and stuff like that. I tend to focus more on I tend to focus more on how people got started and how they keep going. And in your case, you are constantly busy. I mean, it's been very difficult to kind of wedge a corner of your schedule because you are a busy person. So what I'm curious about is, what are your beginnings? What is your background? What got you to be the artist that you are? And especially like from your musical background, where did that come from?
Well, in fact, I didn't have any musical background when I was young. I dropped it at school. I didn't learn an instrument. I'm completely self-taught. If anything, I was better in art. I was actually quite good in art in sciences as well. So obviously all the careers advice you get in those days was science is the thing to do. That's where you're going to get a job. There's no point in doing art. But if you're good at art, you're good at art. So I kind of did it in my spare time when I was at sixth form, and also when I was at university, studying of all things biochemistry, which obviously I don't use a lot now, but there you go. And I was certainly in that time, sort of mid to late 70s, I beg your pardon, into the music of Tangerine Dream and Klaus Schulze and Asher and Vangelis and all these bands. I love that kind of stuff. Right. And while I was at university doing screen printing in an art studio in my spare time, somebody told me that there was a sound studio upstairs, and they had some of the gear that bands like Tangerine Dream used. This was the VCS3 synthesizer.
Right.
So I walked one day, I got the guy to show me these sounds that these machines could make, and this may sound like a cliche, I was just hooked. I thought this was fantastic, and within the space of about a month, I literally had packed all my screen printing stuff away and started to work in sound, just experimenting with tapes and tape loops, VCS3s, really old synthesizers, and that was probably in 1979, and I just haven't stopped since. I've had regular jobs until about 13 or 14 years ago. I ran all this alongside a regular job to earn me an income. But about that time period ago, I made the plunge and decided to go full-time and haven't looked back.
Sure. What part of your the many things that you do actually precipitated you being a full-time musician? Was it the library work or the sound design or the actual music releases?
You guessed first time. The music for the commercial work I do for TV and documentary and film work, that earns me the lion's share of my income.
Sure.
Without that, I mean, there's no one can run a label such as Din, an independent, small, niche label, and make enough to really live off.
Sure.
Don't get me wrong, it does okay. I earn quite a bit off it, but not enough to earn a single income off that.
Right.
I do Din more for the love of it. I do sound design because I like messing around with cool sounds, and I do the commercial work for DeWolf because obviously that pays a decent amount as well. All three added together earns me an income, but certainly the production music earned me enough to enable me to go full time.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Now, doing library music as well as all of the releases that you've done, doesn't that have the potential of sort of like tapping out your creative juices?
It may have the potential, but the different kind of disciplines, to be honest. The library music is quite good in a way because obviously a lot of electronic guys, they do long pieces. You can go on for a long time, and the piece could be 10 minutes, 20 minutes long. So when you have to work to a 2.5 to 3 minute brief with a proper ending in that as well, it's a completely different discipline to the more self-indulgent stuff that you can get up to on Din and such things. So that the two don't overlap that much. But if you're a creative person, you're just a creative person. There's some days the ideas might not flow into the ideas, they just do. So you just kind of do it, to be honest. You can't quite pin down how and why, you just do.
Sure, that's great. So what do you do then to kind of, what do you do away from music to kind of refresh yourself?
I like to walk a lot in the countryside, bird watching I like a lot. Just those kind of things, chilling out, drinking nice wine and beer, cooking nice food, reading books, that kind of thing. Just to chill.
Sure, that sounds very, very nice, and you live in a nice spot to be able to do it. Now, one of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about, because I find it fascinating, when you look at the Din label's releases, an extraordinary number of them are collaborations, and collaborations with some amazing people. And collaborations, some of the collaborative work is some of the most interesting music that I listen to, some of the stuff that I most enjoy. So like your collaboration with Robert Rich or with Markus, are just some of my favorite things that have been released, period. First of all, how do you put yourself in a position to get the opportunity to collaborate with these people? I mean, do they come to you? Do you search them out? Or how does that work?
A lot of it's word of mouth. Markus, Reuter, who you mentioned, was actually one of the first, was the first musician I collaborated on with the Distant Rituals album. Din 2 was the second ever release. He was recommended by a mutual friend called Sid Smith, who was kind of helped me at the beginning to set up Din in terms of how I was thinking. He was a good sounding board, so I could talk to Sid about what I wanted to do. And he knew of Markus, who was quite young at the time, and put me in touch with Markus, who sent me over. I hadn't heard of Markus. He sent me over some tracks using his loops on his guitar, his touch guitar, and they were just so cool. They were just so cool. And we got in touch, and we work extremely well. He's a completely different style of musician to me, but that's really good. I think we complement each other very well. Something like Robert, I'd met Robert at various trade shows, the NAMM trade show when I was working for Akai, which was one of my full-time jobs, going across to Los Angeles to go to the NAMM show. I met Robert over there, and obviously we knew of each other's stuff. And again, we come from two different kind of styles of electronics, but again, we just got on really well. And for those 3 albums that we did, it was really good. But the guys like Mark Shreve, who I work with Arc, I've known Mark for a long, long time, since the early 1980s, when coincidentally we were both on a little cassette label in the UK. So a lot of it's word of mouth. I don't really seek people out as such, but you come across people in your travels, and some people you just gravitate towards. You just have a connection, and it just works.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mention your work with Mark Shreve as well. I that also is among some of my favorite work. I just tend to listen to a lot of your stuff, so there you go. Now, I'm curious, when you work in these collaborations, do you ever work face to face, or is it all exchanging files?
To be honest, most of it's face to face, even with Robert Rich, right
Really?
across in San Francisco. The first 2 albums, I flew over to his place in just south of San Francisco, and worked over there. And I think on Outpost, actually, he was also in the UK close to the UK doing some concerts, so he came to my place. Mark's not so bad because he's in the UK.
Right.
Most of what I do with Markus has been face to face. I'd much prefer, it's not always possible, but wherever possible, I would prefer to do face to face. Because when you're in the same, when you're in the same physical space, you kind of bounce ideas off each other, and things just happen which wouldn't happen in a purely virtual way.
Yeah, I agree. And in fact, most of the instances where I've tried to do remote work by exchanging files has been an abject failure, because there's nobody's eyes to look into to know what's coming next, you know?
Yeah.
Beyond Robert and Markus, who are my 2 favorites of your collabs, what are some other collaborations that you've done that really jump out at you as having been very successful?
Eric Vollo, I think, the Frontiers album, I think that was a particularly good one. It's the only direct collaboration we did, although we actually did release a download-only album of our performance, which we played at the Electric Circus Festival. Mm-hmm. So I think the one with Eric was very good. We both come from similar climes in the north, so I think we had a kind of a similar vision to the kind of sound we wanted, and that one worked very well, I think.
When you're doing this stuff, do you tend to work in a studio, or do you try and find? So it sounds like maybe like with some of these, you either go to their home studio or their working studio, or they come to yours. Have you ever done any collaborations like just in a hotel room, or done live recordings or anything like that?
Well, not in a hotel room. Live recordings, certainly. There's quite a few of the Din albums are performances live. Several of the Arc concerts have been released, like the one Church, which was the concert we did across in Philadelphia for Chuck Van Zyl. The one I just mentioned with Eric, the EC12 release, that was a live release. So as part one of the releases with Robert Rich, React, the third one, that was also a concert in Philadelphia. So sometimes you meet up for a concert, and the performance you do at the concert is unique. So that's often worth documenting and releasing as an album as well.
Now, one of the things that you said when you talk about some of these successful collaborations is that there's a significant difference between kind of how you approach music, or the music that's in your head, and the person that you're working with. What are the ways that when you first sit down with a new collaborator, how do you kind of map out those differences? Do you talk about it? Do you just play for each other? Do you try ideas? And how do you, and especially I'm curious, how do you reject ideas that didn't seem to go the right way? Do you make the decision? Do you share the decision? How does that work?
No, we share the decision. It's an interesting question. I'm trying to think of some examples here. With Outpost, here's an interesting one. And this is a good way when you're working with another musician who's really clued in how you can come up with something you wouldn't have thought of doing in the first place. Because in a way, the most interesting ideas are things you wouldn't have thought of if you were working apart. And it's even things you didn't even talk about. So the first album, Outpost, with Robert Rich, we'd kind of talked roughly what kind of sound world we were going to use. And I knew I wanted to use his Gliss guitar, because his Gliss guitar sound is just a wonderful signature sound he used. But we didn't want it on every track, but we wanted to use that. So we kind of talked about those kind of things. But I arrived at his studio, and unbeknownst to me, his acoustic little baby grand piano he had there, he prepared it a la John Cage by putting rubbers between the strings. Now, I love the sound of a piano, and I think at some point in our conversation we talked about this, but I didn't know he did this. And I sat down at the piano, and surprise, surprise, it was the prepared piano sound, where the strings, you mute the strings by putting the rubbers between the strings.
Right.
And that became a little signature sound on that album, which I played. It's at the very beginning of the album, it's at the very end. It like kind of bookends the album. And that was a nice little idea that you just would never get if you were working apart.
Right.
And it wasn't discussed. It was almost like a surprise that he set for me, and then I reacted I reacted to that in a very positive way. But a lot of these things you don't really need to discuss. You just kind of know between the two of you. You kind of look at each other and you go, yeah, that's cool. Or you go, no, that isn't working. I don't think I've ever had an argument with any of the musicians on Din where one of us really wanted to do something and the other one really didn't. It's usually kind of like almost an unspoken bond. You just know when something is working.
Sure.
You can't really quantify it.
Right. Well, that's really interesting, and that really speaks a lot to your choices of collaborators, because that kind of unspoken communication is hard to come by on just rank strangers. Now, I'm curious about another thing. So you have a lot of releases, as we both now have mentioned, almost countless. I am curious. Yeah. I'm curious about something, because it's something I and a lot of other electronic musicians struggle with, and you don't seem to have a struggle with it. And that is deciding that something is done and deciding that something is ready for release. What are the processes that you go through in your own head to basically say, I've worked on it enough, it's ready to go out the door?
Well, the honest answer is it's difficult to quantify. Again, I just know. After all these years, intuition is something that's quite important. I just know when something's finished. Often less is more, and sometimes you just don't need to keep putting things on a track. Often, I don't necessarily finish a track on the day I'm working on it. It may rest around for a bit, and I may go back to it. But I don't try to overwork something. Obviously, there's technical things you have to do at the end. You have to EQ and compress and master the sound. But those are purely technical things. So it's very difficult to answer your question. Going back to when I worked with the various collaborators, you just kind of know. I mean, I know that's no help to you in a way, but it's unquantifiable. You just know when something is finished. And indeed, finishing a piece and actually getting it out is often the hardest thing. And I know of lots of friends who are electronic musicians or even other styles who've got a stack of stuff on tape or data or CD or whatever, and they never put these things out because they never seem to get around to finishing something. So It's probably quite a useful skill I've got, but how I would quantify it, I really got no idea.
I see. Well, it is interesting, though. I mean, you can add me to the list of people who have a ton of recorded material that's not released. It's maybe one of the reasons why I have steered more towards live performance, because in live performance, you do it, and then you've pushed it out there, and whatever it was, and that's the limit of what you can add to it, right?
Well, that's another approach, of course, playing live, but it's in some ways, not every track, but often I use this phrase, I paint pictures in sound.
Right.
So sometimes I literally have a picture in my head of the track. It's already composed. It's actually in my head. All I've got to do is to get it out of my head through the keyboards and various synthesizers on the hard drive of the DAW and to actually get it down there. So often I actually already know what a track's going to be like before I even start. As I said, not every track, but quite often I do have an idea in my head.
Do you ever have tracks in your head that don't match your style?
Probably not, no. It's difficult to say. Well, it's difficult to say what matches my style because, of course, I've done quite a wide range.
That's true.
Not everything I do sounds the same. So, and in fact, I'm not going to give anything away, but I do have something planned which I think may take quite a lot of people by surprise. I'm not saying it's the completely new, but it's certainly a lot different to what I've been putting out over the last few years. That'll be interesting to see how people react to that. But I'm not giving anything away just at the moment.
Okay. I would say that of the, again, using sort of like the classic electronic music framework as a style, I feel like you have bounced around many different boundaries of that style. Right. And I think some of it is because of the collaborations, but I think some of it is because you're not afraid to try something new or try something a little different. And so it's kind of good to hear that you're still willing to push yourself. I mean, it would have been very easy for you at some point to just say, well, I'm just going to start kind of like shooting out Berlin school things, and, you know, the people that love them will love them. But you've always kind of pushed different boundaries, and I've always found that really interesting.
Well, I think you have to for my own peace of mind and sanity. I would just get bored, to be honest. I mean, the Berlin School side of things is obviously the background where I grew up. I've been across over here in the UK and stuff. That's the music that I heard. So obviously the stuff I do with Mark Shreve is ARC. That's very much in that kind of style,
right?
And it's great fun to do. Mark's a great friend and a musician to work with. He's got this wonderful big old vintage Moog, so we can get that sound. None of the virtual things or new. We can get the exact sound those guys got. We've got the big Moog, and it just sounds so cool.
Right.
But I wouldn't want to do that all the time. And obviously, working with Markus and Robert Rich and musicians like that, you can go into completely different worlds. But coincidentally, of course, both Markus and Robert are more guitar-based. They play keyboards as well, but often the guitar's more of a focus of what they have, but they don't play guitar in a straightforward guitar way. Obviously right. Robert with his gliss guitar and Markus with his lute. So that's very interesting. And in fact, one of the things I wanted to do with Din was to encourage not only myself to work with other musicians, but other collaborations to form from the groups of people who have been on Din. So Eric Vollo and Bernard Vostenreich, for example, they worked together a few times. So that's kind of cool, getting different musicians to work together. And you just never know what's going to come out. Often when I start an album with Robert or Markus or somebody like that, you don't really know how it's going to end up.
Right.
I know. Before I said I often have things in my head, but not so much when you work with somebody else. And in fact, it's much more fun not knowing how it's going to turn out than knowing how it's going to turn out in those examples.
Right, because then the music ends up becoming one of actions and reactions, and that's again where you're going to get something that you could have never planned. That's
correct. Yeah, I mean, there's a certain amount of planning, but a lot of it happens on the hoof, and there's been some really wonderful musical surprises along the way, and that's one of the things that does keep me fresh. I'm not a musician who could just put the same style out. I don't think it's physically possible because I've been putting out stuff for over 35 years now. So to do the same for that length of time would be, not very interesting. Certainly not for me.
Sure. Now you are kind of one of the elder statesmen of electronic music. But in an environment that has become very much a mainstream environment again. I mean, with dubstep and some of the techno styles, as well as what people are doing with hip hop and stuff like that. In many cases, these things are really very much informed by electronic music principles that you and your friends and your collaborators and stuff developed many, many years ago. What of that kind of genre, or of those genres, what is out there that you find really interesting?
There's a few things. I mean, I like. Let me think. I like Boards of Canada. I think they do some great stuff.
Yeah.
That's a very distinctive sound. It's been much copied. Though it's not strictly electronic, a lot of the stuff that Niels Fram does on the Erased tapes stuff. That's some really cool stuff. He often uses piano, but he uses synthesizers alongside that. That's good. Those are, I mean, without sort of sitting down and really thinking about it, that's two people who spring to mind.
Sure. That's cool. That's especially the boards. I mean, you're right. They have been so influential that there's almost like entire genres of music that have shown up because of some of their influence. That's really poignant. Now, another thing that I want to ask you, and you kind of talked about it when you were talking about some of the ways that you met or interacted with people, is that you are part of sort of like the group of electronic musicians that does performances all over the world. And particularly, I'm curious what you feel like is the difference between the electronic music world in England or maybe in broader Europe, and what you see when you come to America.
Well, there's a lot of crossover, of course. I find, I mean, let's take two musicians. Obviously, Robert, which I've worked with, and Steve Roach. Let's stick with those two guys.
Okay.
Especially Steve Roach's tracks and pieces that I've heard. It has what I would call a widescreen kind of feel. The landscapes in the States are huge. You've got big landscapes. There's deserts, the mountain ranges. It's all very big. I don't mean in terms of a bombastic sound, but you feel these big open spaces. And I think certainly Steve and Robert as well have captured that sound. Over here, the Berlin school doesn't really have that kind of feel. It's more of a spacey feel. So that's certainly one thing that I've noticed. There's a much more of a cosmic spacey feel over here.
Right.
There's more of a landscape, kind of wide open space feel in the States. I don't know whether that makes sense or not.
Oh, I think it does. And actually, I have, when you talk about it in cosmic terms, that actually reminds me of one time when I was in Germany for the Frankfurt Musikmesse. I ended up in a hotel that had a TV, and at late night, I would turn on the TV because jet lag would make it so I would be up all night.
Yeah.
I would turn on the TV, and there would be like a guy sitting in a chair expounding about something in German, so I didn't know what he was saying, but with like crazy galaxies behind him, and then it would be a cricket, and then it would be electron microscope views, and it was like, I just thought, wow, whoever's doing this late TV is tripping in some amazingly cosmic way, right? And that's the kind of like visual, and that's kind of the headspace that in fact doesn't seem to really exist here in the US as well. I mean, we have like screaming preachers for religious shows, but that's about the closest we have.
Yeah, well, the TV, the state is a whole different subject.
It really is. So if we talk about some of your other work, and particularly your library work, I think library work is something that a lot of people imagine. Well, first of all, I think a lot of people imagine they would be good at it, whether they would be or not, right? But I'm also wondering how do you frame your vision for music so that it works in library music? Because I think there are a lot of people that think they'd be good at it, but I also think that there are probably some really difficult parts of doing it. And I'd kind of like to hear from you what you think are the difficult parts, but also how you make it so that you can take your musical voice and put it in a way that can be usable for television shows or commercials.
Right, okay, it's an interesting question. Now, the first thing is, to be a very successful library music composer, you have to be able to do just about any style. And I can't do any style. So the Wolf aren't going to come to me and say, can you do a country and western album? They're just not. It's not going to work.
Right.
So, yeah, I've got a little niche at the Wolf. They know what I do. The ambient stuff's what I do best. The sound design, the more interesting stuff. So I get away with a lot with live music. A lot of people, I've got visions of live music is the kind of thing you hear in lifts. You can get some very bland stuff. I'm able to get away with a little bit more adventurous than that. But you've still got to have the discipline of the tracks have to be 2.5 to 3 minutes long. They have to have an ending. Can't have a fade out. It has to have an ending, even if it's just purely sound design. So a lot of the stuff I've done for DeWolf, some of the stuff could almost be undone. It's a little bit more tamed. It's a little bit more toned down. Not quite as scary or freaky, or not so many sound effects. And it's mixed in a very kind of conservative way. But I don't think I'm your typical live music composer.
Right.
As I said, they wouldn't come to me and ask me to do a country western album or a jazz album or whatever. Having said that, I am doing some more what you might term mainstream music that might get used on trailers. And I'm working with Nigel, who's a good friend of mine, who also works with DeWolf, and we're combining. He's great at all the drums and the programming of the drums and the glitchy kind of beats and stuff.
Right.
And I can hang my ambient stuff over the top of that. So that's a kind of different field I'm getting into. But again, that's a collaboration, but in the library music world this time.
Sure, that's interesting. So how did DeWolf, did they like run across some of your music and say, hey, this would work well, and then talk to you, and or did you pitch them?
I kind of pitched them. It was the little story was that I was working for Akai, this sampler company, for a good few years, and I was doing, I think about 95 or so, I was doing a demonstration of the Akai gear, and I was, as I tended to do in those days, I just played my regular tracks, but on the Akais, and then people kind of either liked it or didn't. They would buy the samplers, and was one guy in the audience who afterwards came up to me and said, I really like what you heard, what you played there. Have you never considered your music being used on TV or film? And I'm like, yeah, of course I have, but how do you get started? He says, I do a lot of work with DeWolf. I mean, I've since found out this guy, Andy Quinn, is their biggest writer. He's written literally hundreds, if not thousands of tracks for them. And he literally put me in touch with the main guy, DeWolf, and said, why don't you send off an album? So there was an album before Din. This was called The Deep, and I sent off a copy of The Deep because I thought it was quite a filmic kind of a CD.
Right.
And I got a phone call back from this guy, and initially it was like the music, very interesting, but we don't have any work for you at this point in time. And of course, when you hear that kind of thing, you kind of assume, well, that's it. It's
right.
kind of
never going to hear from him again, right?
Exactly. Except 6 months down the line, I got a phone call one night, and Warren at DeWolf said to me, we've got a project coming up. Would you like to give this a go? And I gave it a go. They liked it. They gave me another album to do. And then I've been doing work for them since 1996. So I'll lose track, but it's between 15 and 20 albums worth of stuff I've done for them now.
Wow. Well, okay. Now I can say that I've actually met somebody who got a call back. I'm not sure I'd ever met anyone before.
Yeah. No, it was amazing. And coincidentally, I'd sent them an album called The Deep, which is all about the sea, of course. Right. And the second album I did for them was all about the sea. So that was quite a funny little coincidence as well.
That's hilarious. It sounds to me also like your experience with doing library music is not typical. So it's not like you could say, here, kids, go do like I do, and you'll be able to do library work.
No, I've got this phrase. I think I'm the only professional Ian Boddy in the world. I don't think there's anyone. Yeah, I don't think there's anyone who has followed my path. It's such a convoluted path. It's a path that I've got over the years by, some of it by design, some of it not by design. But it's a unique path that I've taken. So it's difficult sometimes. I can certainly give people advice, but it doesn't mean they're going to be able to follow the path that I took.
Right. Well, but now I am going to ask you to give advice, because if you would run across a 20-year-old version of yourself, what do you think you would tell that person?
Do something else. Well, no, joking apart, to make an income from what I'm doing now is getting harder and harder and harder. We all know what's happening with CD sales, with the downloads, downloads are going up, but they're not really covering the drop in CD sales. It's becoming a lot harder to sell stuff. When I first started out, there was only a handful of people in the UK doing the kind of style of music that I do. Now there's probably hundreds, if not thousands of people, and that's just in the UK. You go on iTunes, there's millions and millions and millions of tracks. How can a new musician stand out from the crowd? It's very, very hard. So I would say if you want to do it because you're passionate about it, you're creative, do it for yourself. primarily always do an art form, be it music making or whatever. Do it for yourself. If along the line opportunities come along where you can make an income, that's a bonus. But don't do it the other way around, or you could be sorely disappointed.
Right, that's really good advice. Now, one more thing. You've talked about how the music industry is changing so radically and stuff. One of the big changes is now the new prevalence of online streaming services like Spotify and now
Apple Music, of course.
Yeah. All of these things now are kind of really replacing the CD, but they don't really replace the CD. And to me, the CD never even replaced the album very much because the lack of liner notes and stuff was pretty rough. But it does seem like streaming music is the future. How do you see that affecting what you do, and how do you see that affecting sort of the quality of or the kind of people that get into doing music kind of professionally?
It's difficult to say. It's a little early. The Apple Music could have a huge impact because obviously iTunes. If you can get all you want for $10 or £10 a month, why would you necessarily buy a download album? And I get sales reports through from the distributor who deals with iTunes for me. I think I've only had 1 month's worth of the Apple Music streaming, so I don't know whether it's going to significantly reduce ordinary digital sales. Time will tell with that. With physical stuff, it's a bit more interesting. The vinyl album, in some ways, is coming back. I don't think it's ever going to get back to being mainstream, but same with CD. A lot of people like to have a physical thing, a product that they can look at, they can touch, they can put on the shelves, they can collect. And I think there'll always be those kind of people. There'll always be collectors there who want a physical object. But I think it's going to become increasingly niche. So I think the CD will probably end up a little bit like the vinyl album is now. It'd be quite like a niche collector's thing. It won't go away, but it'll become an increasingly smaller amount of the overall total sales. Whether streaming can overcome that or not, I don't know. It might just be another nail in the coffin of how easy it is, or not, as the case may be, to make a living from actually putting stuff out. What seems to be happening with a lot of musicians, not necessarily in the electronic vein, or certainly in the mainstream, is to do concerts. What you can't do in the virtual world is to share an experience with other people in the same way you can actually share it in a concert hall or a festival or on a big stage. Those shared events are unique experiences, and I think a lot of people are putting the money into spending things which are a unique experience. So I think it will encourage people to play live, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's a great point and a great thought. Okay, so before I let you go, I said I wasn't going to talk about gear, but I have to throw a gear question at you. Of all the stuff that you use or you have used, what's your favorite instrument?
That's difficult. I'll give you two. Can I have two?
Sure.
The first one I mentioned before is the VCS3. It was the thing that I learned to play on. Anybody who didn't know what a VCS3 is, it's that weird L-shaped looking synthesizer with a little pin board. And it was much used by the Radiophonic Workshop in the UK. A lot of the early Doctor Who stuff had it on. And it's a UK British synthesizer. It's not well known, and nothing sounds like it. It's really not very well made, but it's got something unique about it. And it's what I learned to play on. And I own one now, and it's going to be the last thing out of the door because it's such a weird and wonderful, and in some ways it really is a synthesizer. Although you can kind of play tunes on it, it's not really what it's designed for. The majority of synthesizers are really an organ with lots of presets.
Right.
They have a keyboard, and you play string sounds and piano sounds and all those sort of things. That's, to me, not what a synthesizer is about. Synthesizers should produce sounds that you just never heard before. My second choice is to do with expression when you're playing. A lot of synthesizers, a lot of people still don't think electronic music is particularly expressive. I have a keyboard made by a UK modular synthesizer company, which is based on the Martineau, which is a French keyboard. came out when the air theremin came out. Unlike the theremin, which is an instrument you don't actually physically touch, it's a keyboard, but you've got a wire with a ring running along the front of the keys. And you slide that up and down, and that plays the pitch. You've also got a rocker pedal on your left-hand side, which controls how loud the sound is. It can also control the timbre of the sound. If you don't press it down, there's no sound. What this means is you've got total articulation of the sound. It's not like pressing a key on a regular synthesizer, and the envelope kind of it fires off, and the sound will trigger. You have to make the sound get louder and quieter. This modular synthesizer company has done a keyboard called the French Connection, which mimics the Ons Martin keyboard.
Right.
I've used it a lot. Anybody who's got the album Slide of mine, that's why it's called Slide. That's when I first got this keyboard.
Okay.
And I use it on some of my other collaborations. It's this keyboard sound. It kind of wails. It's almost a little bit like Robert Richards' Gliss guitar sound, but it's from a synthesizer, and it's simply the most expressive instrument I've ever played.
Well, that's really interesting that you're using these. It really ties you to your physical movement.
Yes. If I don't press the rocker switch, nothing happens. There's no sound. If you want to do vibrato, you don't use an LF4 for vibrato. You physically waggle the ring slightly up and backwards and forwards. If you want a slow vibrato, you wriggle it a bit slower. If you want a fast vibrato, a bit faster. So it's much more like playing a violin. You've got total control of the expression. I can change the timbre of the sound, the volume of the sound, the pitch of the sound, the vibrato, all the things that regular acoustic instruments can do, you can do on this. And as far as I'm aware, it's pretty unique in terms of a controller for a synthesizer. I tend to use the modular synthesizer, and there's not that many people got this. I don't know of another musician who's got this instrument, although there must be a few out there. And it gives me a little bit of an edge. It gives me quite a unique sound, and I love it. So those are my two choices.
That's
for very different reasons.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I know you're a busy guy. I really appreciate you wedging me into your schedule. It was fantastic to talk to you and fantastic to hear some of these tales.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's been a very good question as well. It's good to talk about not to talk about the gear all the time, even though we've finished on that. But
yeah, indeed. All right. Well, thank you so much, and we'll talk again soon.
All right. Cheers. Bye.
Bye. And there you have it. Wasn't that a great interview? You like how I snuck in a little gear talk at the end just to do it? Can't help it. Anyway, I want to thank you very much for your continued listenership. Next week is episode number 100. Never thought I'd get there. This weekend is also when the funding of the Kickstarter campaign is complete. I want to thank, first of all, in generic terms, everybody that was involved in spreading the word, as well as supporting the podcast through that Kickstarter. Next week, we're going to start announcing the contributors that were so helpful in making that happen, and will be so helpful in getting me set up with a great mobile recording system. So I want to thank you all again very much. With that, have a great week. Bye.